Glass Eye by John Kier Cross. There are things that are funny so that you laugh at them, and there are things that are funny but you don't laugh at them at all. At least if you do, you aren't laughing because they amuse you. You are doing what Bergson says you do when you laugh. You are snarling. You are up against something you don't understand or something you understand too well, but don't want to give in to it. It's the other side of the familiar thing, the shadow turned inside out, the dog beneath the skin of the dog beneath the skin. You can take, for example, the case of Julia. Is it possible to laugh at people like Julia? I have never been able to. Yet Julia is funny. There is something monumentally funny in that terrible gaunt shape, in those wide and earnest eyes, in the red, moist tip of that nose of hers that seems longer than any nose in the world. There is something funny in her uncanny genius for saying the wrong thing, and when she does say the wrong thing, there is a whole world of tragic miscomprehension. A whole world of tragic miscomprehension comes to the surface. Her blue eyes smile seriously. The whole pose and attitude register the fact that a remark had been made. "Behold," Julia seems to say, "a remark, my friends. Remark!" And everyone shuffles a little and looks the other way, or hastily talks about something else. For example, some people with a young baby came to see my wife and me just after we were married. The mother went out for a walk, leaving my wife to look after the child, and suddenly said, glancing at the clock, "Heavens, it's time I went upstairs to feed Celia's infant." And Julia, the little blue eyes smiling, looked up from the magazine she was reading. "Is it bottle-fed?" she asked. Julia is over 40, 42 to be exact. A friend of mine, a man who makes up verse for the magazines, wrote a poem about Julia. He called it "To Julia, a Song for a Lost Mad Girl." Oh, she thought she was in China and a million miles away, among the tall pagodas where the shining geishas play, and the mockingbirds were singing, and the lanterns burning red, and the temple bells were ringing softly, softly in her head. And those high and frozen mountains brought her comfort in the night. Golden fish and silver fountains wove her garments of delight, and the rich mimosa blossoms scented all the shining air, and the mockingbirds were nesting quietly, quietly in her hair. Now, I want to tell you a story about Julia. Is it a funny story? I don't know. I just don't know. There are two people concerned in it, and in a sense they were both funny, Julia and this man, Max Colati, I mean. But I don't think the story is funny. It is grotesque. There is one small twist in it, one odd and unaccountable thing. I must tell you something first. If you called on Julia in her little flat in West Kensington, where everything is just so, where the Burne-Jones panels and the mantel-shelf harmonize so beautifully with the William Morris design on the wallpaper, where the volumes of the Tauchnitz editions of the best English authors smile on you from their bookshelves like rows of well-kept false teeth. If you call on her for tea, say, from the Japanese hand-painted cups, you will see, on the mantelpiece, something that will haunt you more than any other thing in that room of ghosts. You will go away with your brows drawn together in a frown, and your lips pursed up, in an effort to understand, to piece things together, but you will see no more than it can see. It is the story of that thing I want to tell you, the story of that unaccountable glass eye, nestling in its little bed of black velvet on Julia's marble mantelpiece. Somewhere, in one of the philosophic books of the East, there is another story about a glass eye. It concerns, if I remember properly, a beggar who one day asked the philosopher for alms. The philosopher refused and went on his way, but the beggar was a trier and pursued him, shrilly demanding money. He pursued him right out of the city till at last the philosopher stopped an exaggeration and said, "All right, I'll give you money, but on one condition. One of my eyes is a glass eye. Tell me which eye it is, and you shall have all I possess." The beggar looked at him intently, and at length, solemnly, "It's your right eye, master, is the glass eye." The philosopher was astonished. "Tell me how you knew," he cried. That eye was made by the greatest craftsman in the world. It should be impossible to tell it from a real eye. How did you know that my right eye was the glass eye?" "Because, master," said the beggar slowly, "because your right eye was the one that had a compassionate look in it. 5 years ago, when Julia was 37, she lived in a bed-sitting room in a narrow-shouldered house between West Kensington and Fulham. It was a small room, with yellow wallpaper, stained with damp at the corners. There was a marble-topped washstand with a flowered basin, and you were on it. The pictures on the walls were colored engravings of old sailing ships. The landlady's father had been captain once of one of those long, slender vessels that had paddles as well as sails. On the mantel-shelf was an 8-day clock, and in the tilled hearth stood a rusty gas ring on which Julia did her cooking. At this time Julia did not have the reasonably good job she has now. She was a clerk in an old-fashioned solicitor, a man named Moffrey, who even in the 1940s still wore a square black top hat and wrote to his clients by hand, taking copies by the old moist paper method. The loneliness and desolation of Julia's life were appalling. She did not know any of us in those days, so she did not have even the slight companionship and relief we afford her. She got up in the mornings, made herself tea on the gas ring, and cooked a slice of toast before the gas fire. She lunched cheaply at an ABC tea shop with a book propped up before her. In the evening she cooked a simple meal, fried some gammon perhaps, or a chop, and boiled some vegetables, all on the same gas ring, of course, a complicated conjuring trick this, involving much juggling with pots and pans. Then, having washed up, she read or wrote letters to her silent sister in Leicester, and went to bed, generally at 10 or half past. What went on in her mind? Did she ever gaze at the engravings on the walls and wish she might sail in those vanished ships to unimaginable places? Did she, as she read her books, dull novels by dead authors about people who had never lived, did she ever permit herself to be wafted away in fancy to some other and more picturesque life in Spain, Italy, Morocco? Did she long for a knock at the door? Did she hope that the young man in the flat above might come home drunk one night and enter the wrong room? Did she look back on the past and speculate on why it was that things had slipped so unnoticeably away from her? That past of hers, did she realize, do you think, that such lost souls as hers are doomed to fail in everything they touch? She was not a virgin. She had been seduced at the age of 18 by an elderly Midland businessman she never saw again. She had been in love. At one time she had even been engaged to a young man she had met on holiday at a seaside resort, but she never met the object of her love, a lecturer at a church discussion group she had once attended, and her fiancé, after 6 months' tergiversation, finally sent back her letters and the gifts she had showered on him and disappeared. The last she heard of him, he was living at Liverpool, having married a showgirl from Manchester. So, through the long years, old Moffrey got all her devotion, and the small crippled son of her sister got all her love, her chilly and half-frightened love. Once a year this child was sent to London to live with Julia, while his mother went to visit her husband's people in Wales. The spinster curtained off a corner of her room and borrowed a cot from her landlady for the boy to sleep in. She fed him magnificently, took him to cinemas and theaters, bought him toys and books galore, and he, a pale, large-headed child with eyes like balls of putty, accepted everything unquestioningly. The only reward he ever gave her was a wan, abstracted smile. It was late one summer, during one of Bernard's visits, that the tragic episode of the glass eye began. Julia had bought tickets for the Old Palace Music Hall in Fulham. She and Bernard sat on the red plush stalls, indifferently watching the show. It began with an act by 2 acrobats, a man and a woman in white tights and spangled panties. The only thrilling moment was when, at the end, the woman climbed a chromium pole that just balanced on the man's chin. She slipped and almost fell, Julia visualizing the white-clad figure falling into the stalls as seemed inevitable. On top of her, Bernard's crippled legs clasped the boy convulsively to her. He looked up at her in surprise, repelled by the smell of camphor from her clothes. She, as the woman on the stage righted herself, felt sweeping over her an immense wave of relief and tenderness. For the rest of the first part of the program, she trembled violently from time to time, looking down at the pale, abstracted boy. If anything should happen to him while he was in her charge, she had an almost uncontrollable longing to touch the boy's bare, warped knees. Only to touch him. She had never touched anyone. After an interval, there were some ballads by two stout operatic singers. Then an eccentric cyclist took the stage, and then came the high spot of the show. It was announced on the program thus: Max Collotti, the gentleman ventriloquist, with his amazing dummy, George. The curtain rose, and in a moment Julia forgot everything. She forgot Bernard, she forgot the little room with yellow wallpaper, she forgot Mr. Moffrey and the high stool on which she sat in his office. Only one thing in the world existed for her: the figure of Max Collotti. As he sat there on the stage with the spotlight on him, it was impossible to conceive of anything more handsome. His dark hair gleamed, his jaw showed a slight blue shadow, his mustache was exquisitely clipped, his high square shoulders spoke of great strength, his temples were narrow, his eyes deep set, his chin was cleft, his teeth when he spoke shone like jewels. George, the dummy on his knee, was a grotesque doll about 3 feet high, with a huge tow head and staring eyes. Its head moved quickly from left to right. Its voice was high-pitched and nasal as it answered Max's questions with clumsy wit. Julia did not notice the act. She did not bear the cross-talk, paid no attention to the pathetic little song that George sang. She was staring at the incredibly handsome young man, watching every suave, slightly stiff movement. When the tab curtains swung together at the end of the act, she was still staring, motionless, her blue eyes shining, the end of her long nose slightly and pathetically damp. In that one moment, she realized that there could be no other man in the world for her but Max Collotti. All the empty years, the acres of desolation, had been leading up to this glorious climax. As if she were in a dream, she took Bernard home. She gave him some hot Ovaltine and put him to bed in the cot behind the curtain. Then she went to bed herself and lay for a long time, staring up at the dim ceiling and listening to the night noises. Footsteps echoed through the open window from the street, the slow, measured footsteps of a policeman, the quick patter of a young man going home, from a dance perhaps, the strolling mingled footsteps of lovers. Now and again, from somewhere inside the house, a board creaked. A mouse scuttled across the floor. Shivering slightly, she heard it, scraping round the gas ring at the spot she had split some grease earlier in the day. From somewhere beneath her came the resonant snoring off of the landlady. And all the time, as she lay there, she was thinking of Max Collotti. She could not get his image out of her mind, but she did not want to get his image out of her mind. He was, she reckoned, 30, 32, only 5 years younger than she was. What had been his life? Was he, hideous thought, push it under, was he married, Max Collotti, the gentleman ventriloquist? A ventriloquist, a man who could throw his voice, a superb accomplishment? It seemed 32. She, if she took proper care, if she learned to make up properly, might pass for 35. Was he tall? All the time on the stage he had been sitting down. He had not risen even to take his curtain call, but he seemed tall. The broad shoulders vouched for his tallness. Max Collotti. A wonderful name, a name full of poetry. Max Collotti, Mrs. Max Collotti, Madame Collotti, or was it Signora Collotti?